Hey everyone, welcome to week 3 of our Good News series. Last week we found out the problem has a solution. Everybody has a problem, but there's a solution for all of us. This week we find out exactly who is behind that solution. Lean in. Listen, we've been in this series, Good News, and I don't know a single person that doesn't need some good news. We live in a world that's just swamped with bad news, and it's just got just enough flair to make us click, and then click again, and then click again, and get stirred up all along the way. And on the random chance that we find some good news along the way, it's crazy temporary, and it's only for a few people. What we actually need is good news that's for everyone and for always, that supersedes and gives us a lens through which to see all the other things that we're experiencing in life. And the story of Jesus and what he is writing in our lives is exactly that kind of good news. It's exactly that kind of story. Now we're in week 3. I encourage you to catch up if you're just finding your way here. You're in the perfect spot. You can belong way before you believe. This is a place for you to figure out what God might have in mind for you. And spoiler alert, it's really good. Good news, week 1, we said this, there's good news, and it's for everyone. Everyone. You are loved by God, and everyone is called to belong, every single one of us. This is the good news of Jesus. And on top, when we step into our reality, this is the good news from last week, felt like bad news for a long time, because every one of us has a problem. There's a problem that's not just in everybody else, as easy as it is to see in everybody else, it's in everyone, including me. And if we get bold and look closely, we find, man, we need a solution in good news. God says, I'll walk you right out of the problems you're experiencing. I'll step into your life. The problem has a solution. The solution is for everyone, and it's invited into a relationship with God. The gospel of Jesus is good news for everyone, and week by week, we're just stepping one further step into that with a couple of hopes. One, that if you aren't living like deeply and alive with Jesus, if you aren't experiencing the change and things that he has in mind for you to put you back together piece by piece, we're just praying and hoping that you find your way into that. And in any way that makes sense for you to say yes and take a step in his direction. For the many of us who have pointed our lives toward Jesus, it's good for us to remember and revisit all that God has done for us. It makes us celebrate and like filled with energy, particularly to take the good news that we have experienced and received everywhere we go. And so this is why we're giving it taglines every single week. Good news, because there are people you're gonna see all week who are in desperate need of some good news. God has invited you into it, and we have the privilege of sharing this everywhere we go. So I wanna invite you, today what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at the good news that we see in Romans chapter 4. Romans was a letter written by a guy named Paul to the city of Rome, a bunch of followers of Jesus in Rome, and he just piece by piece walks us through what's the big deal with Jesus. So if you've ever wondered, like, what is this really about? What is this really at the core of our faith? He helps us with this. We're gonna look at Romans 4. And so I actually wanna encourage you, if you have the app, even if you brought a paper Bible, if you have the app, I encourage you to grab it and open it and change the version that you read the Bible into the Message version. You may not know this, the Bible was not written in English. It was written in Greek and Hebrew and some Aramaic. And so it's translated. No matter what version you read, it's a translation. There's lots of good ones. We usually use the New Living Translation. But I want to expose you to another really helpful translation called the Message version. In fact, I've been listening to it in some of my drives along with the music I listen to. I've been listening to Romans 1-8 on the audiobook. It's so good. It's so clear. And bonus, the guy sounds like John Malkovich. I don't know if it is, but I just like it. And so you might even try that this week, but check out the version. If you don't have the app, go ahead and download it. We're gonna be in Romans 4 here in just a minute. We don't have to look very far around our lives to see that things aren't right? Things look good with darkness and distance. But once you get up close and shine a little light on relationships and homes and workplaces, you look close enough, or if you get really bold and look in a mirror and reflect on our own lives, it doesn't take long to see a mess. Not just around us, but in us. The problem that we have is in everybody, not just everyone else, but it has a solution. Today, what we're gonna talk about is who begins that solution. If you get the answer to this question wrong, everything goes in the wrong direction, and good news becomes bad news really fast, like crazy fast. Even if you start off in the right direction with who is the originator of the good news, if that gets just 1 degree off or starts to wander just a little bit, good news becomes bad news really fast. And so here it is in a sentence today. Good news from Romans chapter 4. God sets things right. God sets things right. This is, like most sentences in Romans, a loaded sentence. I read this from Romans chapter 3 just a few minutes ago. God is the one who sets things right. You know what that means? It's not you. You're not the one who sets things right. Not by your behavior, not by your choice, not by your history, not by your future, not by your commitment. You are not the one I am not the one who sets things right. God is the one who sets things right. What we saw last week is that our behavior and what happens in our lives, a lot of the things that we have done have disconnected us or offended God, and our relationship with Him is not right. Things are not right. And in good heart, we often try to take responsibility for that and step into that and try to make things right. But let me just remind you, God is the one who sets things right. Turn to somebody around you with a little bit of bossiness, but a lot of conviction. Tell them, God sets things right. Now, what I mean by right, it doesn't mean everything gets fixed and goes exactly the way you always dreamed. What I mean mostly, and what Paul means in Romans chapter 4, is that whatever was wrong between God and us, He makes right. Now, we're gonna spend the next several weeks, actually even kind of this next several months, talking about how that works, how we participate, how we go along with that. But you just need to know the most important thing that could ever happen in our lives is for God and us to get on the same page. Because then we have His presence, we have His strength, we have His wisdom, we have His resource, we have His love, we have His identity, all the good that comes into our life that God wants to bring into our life. All the good we talked about, the blessing God has in mind through the series we did, Kingdom Pace, all of that happens when things between us and God are right. And so what we're gonna talk about, I'm only gonna talk about one thing. There's gonna be times where you're like, I think you might be talking about someone else. And I'm gonna be like, nope, I'm still talking about the same thing. For a long time today, because when this wanders, things go bad fast. When we lose sight of this, we get upside down quickly. And so we're gonna start in Romans chapter 4, verse 1. Again, I'm gonna read out of the Message version. Verse 1, it says this: so how do we fit what we know of Abraham, our first father of the faith, into this new way of looking at things? Now, I know you've always been asking this question. You showed up. How does Abraham fit into this? None of you did. We'll get to this guy in a minute. Romans answers lots of questions that are different than the way we would ask him now, but I'll get back to it in a minute. If Abraham, this is so key for us, if Abraham, by what he did for God, got God to approve him, he could certainly take credit for it. If it was Abraham's work that made things right, he could take credit. But catch this, the story we are given is a God story, not an Abraham story. The story you are invited into in the good news is not a you story, it's a God story. We said this week 1. The moment we forget that the gospel and the good news is all about Jesus, we go wrong. We start looking at things wrong. It's not about us. It catches us up and transforms us, changes us in all the best ways, but the moment we start to think it's about us, we've lost track. This is a God story, he says, not an Abraham story. What we read in the scripture is that Abraham entered into what God was doing for him. And that was the turning point. He trusted God, catch this. He trusted God to set him right instead of trying to be right on his own. I'm just gonna let it sit. He trusted God to set him right instead of trying to be right on his own. A lot of us are exhausted, and a lot of us feel like the good news is bad news because we're trying to be right on our own. We're trying to fight, claw, earn our way back when God says that was never my desire from the beginning. The story we're in is a God story, not an Abraham story. The story that he is writing is a God story, not a put your name here story. It's not a Drew story. It is a God story from beginning to end. And so remember, we're all talking about the who. Who sets things right? Is it you? No, God sets things right. Don't lose that. Now, if you look at Abraham from his point of view, Abraham was the very first person that God said, I'm gonna build a whole nation and I'm gonna rescue the whole world beginning with you. After everything had gone wrong in the very beginning, mankind turning their back on God, God said, I'm gonna put things back together. I can't leave them separate from me. And so he goes to this guy named Abraham. And if you tell the story from his perspective, this is Abraham's story. He left his home. He brought part of his family along, and mid-journey, his dad gets too old, they stop moving, eventually they carry on farther. They end up having a child in extremely old age. Along the way, there's a massive test in their life, even around that shaped them and forged this family. And they would become the original family that would grow into millions of people we would call the Israelite people in the Old Covenant, or in now we would call them the Jewish people, the very first one. Worldwide people group, originating in one man named Abraham. And many of the people who would receive this letter we just read, Romans, in the very first century, were people who had come from that heritage. Now, I don't have time to tell you why, but that heritage had become built very much, and for a lot of valid reasons, had been built around doing the right things, having the right behaviors. They felt like, because God had given them instruction, that the way they stayed right with God was through behavior. You'll see it in the Bible called the law. You're familiar with part of it, known as the 10 Commandments. If they just did the right things, they would stay right with God. But in that plan, who does the making right? People do. And the burden becomes unbearable because just like we said last week, how many of us can stay right with our behavior? How many of you always do the right thing, always do what you even want to do, right? The person you imagine, you have a picture in your mind of what you want to do, and you always manage to do that. You never come up short, you never fail. Anyone? Show of hands. Ask the person next to you if you're unclear. They know. But these people had become bent on honoring God and staying with him by doing what was right. And their identity, for a number of reasons, was just wrapped up in this idea of obedience. But they also, in the first century, when this letter was sent to people, they lived among a group of people known as the Gentiles who had none of that history, none of that awareness of God's story, none of those behaviors. And something crazy happened in Jesus. He said, this is for everyone. And now these two groups on each side are like, well, which is it? Do you have to go back and catch up? Do you have to play catch up to be a part of this? Do you have to become a Jewish person to do this thing? Or the Jewish people are like, you can't be in. You haven't done all the right stuff. And they're like, but Jesus said, I don't know. Sorry, man. There's this tension that he's navigating the whole time. But to be the kind of people who say behavior finds our way in to making things right with God is to read the story as an Abraham story when it's not. It's a God story. You should read it. Take some time this week. Genesis chapter 12 through 22. Won't take you long. Take you about 15, 20 minutes to read through it and see the story of Abraham unfold and just underline every time God does something and circle every time Abraham does something and watch how they compare. Always in response, always in trust. Abraham's actions were always in response to God's promises. This was a God story. Abram was just a guy moving from one place to another. When God shows up and says, keep going, don't stop here. From the very beginning, God says, I promise your family, which, by the way, you don't have any kids. You can't even imagine a family. You think your family's about to end right now because you're 75 years old and you don't have kids yet? God says, nope. You're going to have kids, and you're going to be an enormous nation. And not only are you going to be a nation, but I'm going to give you a land in which that nation is going to dwell, and you will be my people. And the way that I care for you and love you will show the world who I am. And on top of that, from your family, I will bless the whole world. The good I have in mind, Abram, is going to come through your ancestors, even though you're 75 and you don't have any kids. And Abraham does something crazy. And it's exactly what you're invited to do. It's to take God at his word. God showed up. Abraham had done nothing to earn his favor, nothing to earn his promise, had done nothing to make a way for God to do these things, but God made a promise, and he has a habit of keeping them. And so God provided and protected for him as he made this move. They go through all kinds of adversity. You got to read it in Genesis 12 through 22. And for the next 20 years plus, Abram is like, hey, God, remember you said we were going to have some kids and become a nation? I'm 99. Do you need some suggestions? I have some ideas, God, if you're having a hard time putting this together. It's a facetious way to see it, but you'll see it in Genesis 18 to 20. The story unfolds like this. We have this same habit of trying to take control back. When God's timing doesn't match ours, we try to take over and try to make things right. Never works out, always goes wrong. But when Abraham starts to question, he goes to God, and God, instead of backing off or being offended, he doubles down on the promise. He says, not only am I going to make your ancestors a great nation, your ancestors will outnumber the sand on the seashore. And so Abraham trusts him. And at 99 years old, and the Bible says his wife, who was well along in years, such a generous assessment of age, they welcome Isaac into their home. You got to read the challenge they endure in verse 20. Abraham was being taught and shaped by God. God was a promise keeper, followed through all the way through. It was always a story of trust where God went first, where God made things right between he and Abraham then just walked with God. God made the relationship right, and Abraham just responded by keeping in step with him, trusting him, counting on the promise that God had made to him. His response was never to lead out in action or earn anything, but instead to respond to a God who was faithful and trustworthy. Your faith is only as good as what you place it in, and the faithfulness of God always delivers. And so we live in a responsive posture of trust with God. He makes us right, and we get to walk with him. This is what Paul goes on and says in verses 4 and 5. He says this, if you're a hard worker and you do a good job, you deserve your pay. That makes sense, right? And we don't call what you get a gift at that point. You earned it. It's your wages. He says, but if you see that a job is too big for you, like a 75-year-old man beginning a family, like all of us who have faced our level of brokenness and realized we are not winning at putting ourselves back together. This is really what makes us followers of Jesus. We just realize we need more than we brought. When you realize that the job is too big for you, that it's something only God can do, and respond by trusting him to do it, you could never do it for yourself, no matter how hard or long you worked. Well, it's that trusting him to do it, which I love Eugene Peterson's translation of the word faith. Trusting him to do it. That's what gets you set right with God, by God. Because who sets you right? God does. I'm going to bang this drum for like another 20 minutes, so you're going to have to participate, all right? By God, it's sheer gift. We're just a bunch of people who have realized that trying to make ourselves right, trying to put things back together, trying to get things going the right direction, it works in some ways for a little while, but never all the ways for a long time. But what we're finding is the more we point our lives in Jesus, the more that we trust him, the more that we take God at his word, that we can actually walk with him, that he's made us right with him, and that his strength is what we need to be made right, the better things go. Good news, God sets us right. Let me give you another way to say it. Good news, it's not all on you. Did you hear that? It's not all on you. This putting your life back together, this setting off in the best direction, this becoming the sort of mom or dad, the sort of friend or coworker, the kind of neighbor, or just simply the kind of person you want to be, hear me, it is not all on you. Turn to somebody around you with some bossiness and some conviction that just demands agreement, and tell them, it is not all on you. Don't miss anybody. Don't leave them on their own. Even if they won't look at you, you tell them. Listen, You're gonna go somewhere this week. You're gonna be standing in line at the coffee shop. You're gonna be pumping gas at the gas station. You're gonna walk into work and you're gonna see someone who just like their posture, their demeanor, all the things about them is just feels the weight of the world where they're just struggling and climbing and clawing. You'll feel the COVID like crankiness, the edginess that they've been enduring for the last number of months. And they need some good news. And here's good news. It's not all on you. You don't have to carry it that heavy. I know some of us are like super responsible, and we actually feel heroic when it actually is all on us. But you need to know it's not all on you. Some of you have been shut down, just trying to struggle and claw your way through the day so you can climb into bed and pretend things don't exist for like 15 minutes. And you need to hear this. It's not all on you. There's good news. God is up to something. God has a story to write in your life, and it is a God-sized story, not a you-sized story. It is first and foremost about him and how awesome he is. But the way he shows his awesomeness all the way from the beginning in Abraham was to say, you, watch how I put you back together. Just see what I have in mind for you. Just trust me enough to walk with me. I'll make things right. You never have to wonder if we can be connected. You never have to wonder if you're good enough. You don't have to earn your way into my graces. I will show up, and as a free gift, I will make you right with me, and then we walk. Amen. Now listen, this is a tectonic shift in the mindset of many of us. Because so many of us, in the name of responsibility, and unfortunately, sometimes in the name of Jesus, have been taught that it actually is all on us. And the shameful looks, and the disappointment, and the condemning posture along the way have taught us that, wait, I guess there are like 4 or 5 steps I'm supposed to take before God actually starts to work in my life. But what did he say about Abraham? He trusted God to set him right instead of trying to be right on his own. Not a single step that you can take makes you right with God. God sets things right. He has done this. It is done. It is finished, Jesus said on the cross. There is not an earning. There is not a proving. Are there steps to take once we join in with him? Yes, but he's so generous. He walks with us. He doesn't expect us to do it for ourselves. He knows we couldn't. God sets things right. It's not all on you. Like a 2-year-old trying to tie a tennis shoe, there are things we simply cannot do ourselves. Right? Think about it for just a minute. When's the last time you tied a 2-year-old's tennis shoe? Some of you are like, listen, I don't settle for that. I'm all Velcro, and you're wise. Mad props for you. But somebody along the way is gonna buy you some really cool tennis shoes, and like, yeah, cool, bro. I gotta tie these things. Watch the wonder of a 2-year-old as they see you tie the shoe for the first time. It's like, what sort of sorcery do you know that can make that happen? You set them to do it on their own, and what you get is a rat's nest, maybe, or just a bunch of flipping strings around. This is what it is. This is a picture. There are things we cannot do for ourselves. We cannot make God love us, and good news is we don't have to. You cannot earn your way into God's favor. You can't be done. It's not us who sets things right. It's God who sets things right. You hear it. I'm saying the same thing over and over. Is it sinking yet? But here's the beauty, is he didn't ask us to figure it out. He says, let me help. There's someone who is with us, because here, good news. We said this week 1, the good news is relational. It's not transactional. It's not something that you go pay and get something back. It's not something you work and then get paid. That's not how this thing works. What it is an invitation to a relationship. We said this last week, that the problem we all have is solved in relationship with Jesus, because it's his strength, his partnership, his companionship, the Spirit alive in us that actually puts us back together. Abraham accomplished nothing except trusting God to accomplish everything. Right? This is what he goes on to say in verse 16 of Romans chapter 4. If you're in there, scroll down just a little bit on your app. Verse 16. This is why the fulfillment of God's promise depends entirely, not partially, not mostly, The promise, or that's why the fulfillment of God's promise depends entirely on trusting God and his way. And then, having been made right by him, embracing him in what he does. God, you made me right. What do you want to do next? God, you made me right. What's the next step? God, you made me right. There's all kinds of issues. Which one do you want to go after first? God, you made me right. What's the plan you have in store? God, you made me right. What's the next step? God's promise arrives, he says, as pure gift. That's the only way. It's the only way. It's the only way. It's not one of the ways. It's the only way everyone can be sure to get in on it. And make no mistake, he means everyone. He says, those who keep the religious traditions and those who have never heard of them. This is Paul's nod to the Jewish people who had a long history of doing what was right and thinking that made them right with God. And the Gentile people who had no history of that and no idea even where to start. Whichever category you find yourself in, it's the same way we find ourselves in the relationship with God. He makes us right. No matter your history, if you've been trying to earn it your whole life, if you grew up in it, if you know all the things, those things don't make you right. And those of you who know nothing, you don't have any idea even where to begin. You would label things like religious that aren't even have anything to do with Jesus. You have no clue. Like you step in and you're like, I'm just trying not to screw this thing up. I hope people don't see me. Listen, the same place to begin. There's space for you. It does not disqualify you. It does not count you out. He says, listen, wherever you begin, there's space for you. We trust God to set things right because he's the one who sets things right, not us. He's the one who makes sure that we're together so that we can walk forward together. And so we respond to each of his invitations along the way to participate. Whatever you had done before, whatever you had been earning along the way, change your mind. And whatever you have lacked from before doesn't disqualify you. We all get to be in on what God is up to, in us and around us when we trust him. Now listen, some of you who have been following Jesus for a long time, you know that unless we respond to him by doing what he says, we don't get put back together. We call that keeping in step with the Spirit. That's not what we're talking about today. The problem is so many people along the way try to begin there, but the problem is when you begin there, it's you trying to get right. First you get right, then you walk together. So yes, there will be response, and we'll get to it in weeks ahead, but today, who sets things right? It's not you. It's not you. It's not all on you. In fact, he goes on, he makes it really, really clear. Let me just say the same thing again, okay? Abraham was first named father and then became a father. That order matters. It matters more than we would like to know. First, God said, and Abraham trusted. And then some time, and then he became a father, 25 years, somewhere in between there. What made Abraham faithful was he trusted God between here and there. We're named first, then we become. When you flip those, everything goes wonky. He was named first and then became because, and the only reason he became what God said was because he trusted God. He dared to trust God. This is what all of us need to do. Dare to trust God. Stop trying to grab on, stop trying to take control, stop trying to claw and earn, and instead dare to trust God to do what only he could do. Raise the dead to life and make a word, or with a word, make something out of nothing. God is one who can turn graves into gardens. He is one who can take nothing and speak and it becomes something. Like 90s-year-old people beginning a family. This is what Paul probably had in mind. Or maybe he had in mind the story of Abraham and Isaac, which you'll find in the passage I pointed out earlier in Genesis 20 to 22, where a boy good as dead was raised to a life in God's rescue as a foreshadowing of what he would do in Jesus. We receive and trust what God says first. First we're named, then we become, not the other way around. When you reverse those, what you get is religion. Are you catching this? Do all the right things, put things together, get the right behaviors, go the right places, do all the religious stuff so that you can be. That's backwards. That's religion. Religion always sets a bar and says, get over it or else. This is not the story of God. That's an Abraham story, but we actually have a God story. And let me just go one layer deeper. Christians, we're tempted. Our behavior sometimes portrays this. That first you get cleaned up, and then you arrive. First you take care of this, and then. But listen, the prodigal son was still stinky when he walked up the driveway. There is no before. The beginning is trust. God meeting us right where we are in the midst of the mess. It's not a bar to get over. It's a God who came down. And we got to stop messing this up because Christians, too many, are turning the good news bad by demanding behavior before belonging. God begins with belonging because who sets things right? God sets things right. The moment you think you can't step back into presence with God or into connection with God, that first you gotta do something, you have settled for religion and not a relationship. The moment you think you gotta earn your way back, or the moment you think, well, I can't because I did this, it's not your behavior that finds your way out of favor with God. It was Jesus who bought your way in. And so he meets us right in the midst of the brokenness because it's not you who sets things right. It's not all on you. He's the one who sets things right. We can't wander into religion, please. We can't settle for this. It's so tempting, especially after we've started in God's direction and we learn all these behaviors and things that really do fill us. Only when they're done with God, not for God, but with God. Very important difference. When we step into that, we are filled, but what happens is we portray a picture to others that says, do all this and then. No. First we're named, then we become. What God has in mind is a little bit more like this, a loving father who comes alongside his child, tiny legs and the wrong shoes, never having climbed a mountain, and looks at the top of one and says, let's go up there. And the child says, I could never do that. I can only see this much of the path. I can't even see the top. Where even is the top? This tree next to me makes me feel small. How would I ever get there? I don't have the right shoes. I don't have the right capacity. I've never done this kind of thing before. And the father, instead of saying, you know what, you're right, let's not, the father says, you know what, let's do it together. I'll help. God sets us right by casting a vision, meeting us, and promising to go with us because this is not a you story. It's not a me story. This is a God story. And we live in the tension of now but not yet. God names us now, but we're not yet what we will be. God names what is true and promises to go with us and promises to walk step by step by step by step. And Christians, you know this because if you look back over the course of your life at who you were just a minute ago, a week ago, a year ago, 3 years ago, you see his faithful transformation in our lives. We got to just commit to that on the front end. God, you go with me. God, you'll go with me. He says, let's do life together. Being set right with God is not fixing all the circumstances of our life. And it's not demanding that all the things in our life get right so that God will join us. God says, let me join you. I have made you right. It's not all on you. Let's go from here together. And together we will make you right. First he was named, and then he became. He goes on. You thought I was done. When everything was hopeless. Listen, for some of you, when I said earlier, you're gonna see people at your coffee shop and everywhere else, you're gonna see people who are just beat down, overwhelmed, cannot see their way forward. You might be that person. You might have arrived that person. You may have been that person for a while. It says, when everything was hopeless, Abraham believed anyway. And this is so key. This is the turn we got to make. Deciding to live not on the basis of what he couldn't do, but instead on what God said he would do. Religion will always focus on us, and we will eventually come to what we cannot do. What God invites us to is instead to focus on him because this is a who story? This is a God story. And we focus on what he said he would do. And so he was made a father, a 90-year-old man. Listen, I don't know all the things that were different 25 years ago, but 90-year-old men don't have kids, right? Not with a wife who is well along in years. But God said, and it happened. He was named, and he trusted and walked, and he became. And the same is true for us. And so he was made the father of a multitude of peoples. Listen, we're tempted to dig in on the problem like we did last week. And what happens is we get overwhelmed. But the beauty right in the middle, we said, is God's kindness meets us right in the middle of that. It says, I don't expect you to climb this mountain. I want to walk with you. I will make you right with me. You never have to wonder if you have my strength, my resources, my people, my wisdom, all the things that you need along the way. Let's walk together. And slowly, step by step, having been made right with him, he makes things right in us. We're so tempted to try to get out of our mess the way we got in. We say, listen, I screwed up. So the way out of this is to make it right. I got to do the right thing, do the right thing, do the right thing, do the right thing. But listen, getting into the problem, you don't get out the same way. You don't solve a problem on the same level or with the same mindset it was created. What Romans 1-3 says is, listen, it was not behavior that got you jacked up. It was distrust in God. And so the way out is to trust him. Let him name you. Let him call you mine. Let him call you loved. Let him call you our family. Let him call you my child. Let him call you the one made right. Let him call you the one adopted, the one brought in, the one forgiven. This is the name he will give us. This is what he has said and declared is true. And you may not feel it right out the gate, just like Abraham wasn't a dad day one. But first you are named and we trust because it's him who sets us right, and then over time we become. He goes on, he says, Abraham didn't focus. He did not focus. Please don't focus on our own lack of power. He didn't focus on his impotence and say it's hopeless. This 100-year-old body could never father a child. He was right, but it's not the whole story. Nor did he focus on Sarah's decades of infertility and give up. Listen, I know the mountain seems huge. I know the adversity is real. I know the grief has lasted. I know the pain has been caused. I know their failure and their harm is not fake, and it seems huge, but we cannot focus there. God says, no. Trust me. He says, he didn't tiptoe around God's promise, asking cautiously skeptical questions. He plunged into what God said and came up strong, ready for God, sure, confident, unwavering confidence that God would make good on what he said. And that is why it is said, that, not anything else, not a behavior, not an action, not an earning, that, plunging into the promise, being sure that what God said is true. That is why it is said that Abraham is declared fit before God, by trusting who to set him right. It's not on you. It's not all on you. It all begins and ends with him. The good news is God's story. He says, but it's not just Abraham, it's also us. The same thing gets said about us when we embrace and believe the one who brought Jesus to life when the conditions were equally hopeless. God can speak, and dead comes alive. In Jesus' rescue, the sacrificed Jesus made us fit for God, set us right with God. The good news is, it's not all on you. The good news is you were never asked to go alone. The good news is you have nothing to prove and nothing to earn. God sets us right. And the moment we invite him, he brings his strength. He brings his wisdom all along the way, because this is not an Abraham story. This is not a you story. Perfectionists in the room, this is not a perfectionist story. Those of you who are overwhelmed, this is not an overwhelmed person's story. This is a God story who is not overwhelmed and who is not demanding perfection. He is naming so you can become. The question is, will you embrace? Will you plunge into the trust that God is inviting you into? Will you let him work? Will you take your focus beyond your failure and instead keep your eyes on his perfection, his willingness, and his making right in our life? Letting him when to tell you, hey, hold the knot right here as I tie it. Hey, let's just take a few steps. Let's go from here. The question for all of us is, will we trust him? If you've never pointed your life toward Jesus, there is nothing you need to do but say yes and choose to trust what he has said. And for all of us who are followers of Jesus, we take this good news everywhere. We show up at our coffee shop saying, hey, listen, it's not all on you. It's not. You don't have to carry it so heavy. It's not all on you. We show up with good news everywhere we go.
Good news, everyone. God sets things right. As much as we feel like it might be on us, and as much as we're tempted to try to take control, we don't have to. He sets things right. We begin with trust, and then the response follows. We'll talk about that in weeks to come. So don't miss out. If there's any way we can support you, I want to encourage you, head over to canyonridge.org. You'll find everything you need to get everything out of what God is up to in this season. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment, share it with a friend, and don't forget to click subscribe. We'll see you soon.